This is at front. One from I don't know what they're talking about. Yes. Yes. No, I just said inadequate. Be very careful. Sorry. Yes. Careful.
Okay, you know what this logo is?
It's a C.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, really good.
All right, hello everybody, and thank you for being here. I'm going to be talking today about transforming the digital customer journey using AI. We could have also called this presentation why we need to change the customer digital journey to use AI. Okay. So I'm going to start talking about why AI hasn't transformed the world yet, because I think it's also the elephant in the room. I'm going to talk about what needs to happen to effectively leverage AI in transforming that user journey.
Why?
I'll go on to explain why the effect of this transformation on the world and how to keep a steady course. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens next. What sort of implications are we talking about? So why hasn't AI changed the world yet? One of the most influential people in machine learning, artificial intelligence, all these subjects, Andrew, he had this tweet, and he said that AI is the new electricity. Now, electricity was a huge transformation during the 20th century, so it's definitely a very bold statement. So, is Andrew right? I think he is. So, what's actually going on? Why isn't AI transforming the world as we were promised? Well, before I get into the detail, I want to present myself. I'm originally an industrial engineer. I specialize in electricity. Actually, part of my early career was as a design electric engineer. And then I went on to getting into AI because I had done a little bit of machine learning while I was studying. And it was sort of something that I had a sort of calling for AI. And so the comment from Andrew talking about electricity and AI and putting both of those things together, that really called my attention. Today I work as a product manager at Carrefour. I lead several product teams with the focus on pushing intelligent experiences and using artificial intelligence to transform how our users go through the user journey. Okay? So getting back to the question of what's going on with AI, why isn't it transforming the world? Well, it looks like electricity and AI have a lot more in common than just the fact that they have a potential to transform the world. They also have a past, or at least they're sharing a common past. You see, when electricity began becoming more popular at the beginning of the 20th century, it was also a total disappointment. There was a lot of talk about how electricity was going to transform factory floors because of the electric motors and all these sort of new inventions. And so managers at the time thought that could be a good idea, and so they started adopting electric motors. Now the problem was that they didn't see a productivity gain, and so electricity at the moment was a total flop. Nevertheless, everybody had a very clear idea that electricity had a huge potential, but it took 50 years more for electricity to actually transform the factory. So electricity was democratized in 1880. It was the first time that they had a power plant, and they started selling electricity and power to general consumers. And still, about 20 years later, in the 1900s, factories were still using steam. You see, the way that factories worked during the early 20th century is they had a very big steam engine that moved a turbine, which moved a shaft that went through the whole factory floor. And the way that the mechanical energy from the shaft was transferred to the smaller machines was through belts and gears. And so when the managers at the time decided, we're going to adopt electricity instead of continuing to use steam because it's supposed to give such a huge leap in terms of productivity, what they did was they substituted the steam engine for an electric motor. And they saw absolutely no gain in it, basically because the loss of energy, which was being transferred through several systems, was still being lost. So in the end, it didn't really work out. So what had to happen for electricity to really transform the world? It wasn't until the new generation of managers took over the factory floor, and with a completely different mindset, they decided to use electricity in a very different way. Now, you see, it wasn't electricity in itself that was meant to change the factory floor. It was the mindset. It was that mindset that the managers had, which would allow electricity to become an enabler in changing the factory floor. And so these managers, what they did was something very simple. They just took the large electric motor that at first was being placed with the shaft, and they decentralized the energy into smaller, different motors placed around the factory. And this was a big leap in the way of doing things, because this was not possible with steam engines. They weren't sufficiently efficient at small sizes for that to be able to be done. And so decentralizing power distribution had very profound impacts for the factory. Some of them were direct, but I think that most of the most important ones were indirect, and they weren't as easy to anticipate. So for example, factories became much better places to work. They were cleaner, they were less dirty, and they were definitely safer. You went from a model of a factory which was very hard to change into a model of a factory that could be completely rearranged on will. It was much easier to maintain equipment. You see, having one large motor meant that if that motor went down, the factory didn't work. If you had smaller motors all over the factory, well, that obviously meant that if one motor broke, it didn't have why to be such a big deal, right? But there were other transformations that also affected people. For example, having an electric motor instead of a steam engine meant that the pace was set by the workers instead of by the steam engine. They could have downtimes, they could pause for a bit, and so that meant profound changes in how the workforce was managed. And so that meant changes in salary, changes in training, and changes in recruitment. So it had huge, huge changes that improved human life in the factory. So what were the things that enabled electricity to change the factory floor? Where there were two main things. The first one was a change in architecture. It was a change in layout of the complete factory. It went from one central motor or central steam engine to several smaller motors. Big change in mindset. And then the second one is, given the change in the architecture, you could just definitely profit from that change and rearrange how your processes were built. And so that meant that there were huge possibilities, and this is one of the reasons why Henry Ford was able to invent his assembly line, which is a huge revolution for car manufacturers. Now, like I said, these changes didn't just affect the factory floor, they had a very big impact on people both inside and around them. And the thing is that when people change, businesses change also. So many of these indirect impacts change not only the workers, but also the consumers, and as a result, the organizations those consumers consume from. And so the whole idea about transforming the user journey, everything about transformation, it's all about people. Now, there are definitely practical aspects about this transformation with regards to changes of the architecture and those processes, but in the end, it's all about transforming the customer journey of people and through people, okay? Changing architecture and processes is just a first step. It's just a how. It's where to start. So therefore, it's not really technology that changes the world. It's not really technology that transforms things. It's a change in mindset. It's an idea that, coupled with a profound understanding of a technology, will enable that idea to become true. Right? So rather than talking about how AI is going to transform the customer journey, let's talk about how we need to transform our mindset to enable AI to transform the user journey. And so, just like electricity allowed energy to be decentralized throughout the factory floor, AI allows decision-making to be decentralized throughout our different digital touchpoints with clients and our digital platforms. And so, this sort of removes the need to have one same mode for everybody. This suddenly means that you can have a completely fluid experience with fluid interfaces that change based on the individual. And so these systems understand context and show relevant content, which obviously is something extremely important and extremely helpful in being able to personalize that whole experience. And that means we can adapt to being non-linear. We can stop being as rigid as we are today. So this new paradigm is in both how we interact with the digital platforms and our customers, and how we communicate with them. And so this brings me to a little bit of theory on data and information. You see, I think everybody here understands that you can't really reach a point where you're going to be able to leverage AI if you don't really have a good understanding about data and data management and information, right? So this is a cost curve. It's traditional cost curve for communication and information, okay? So on the y-axis, we have richness of information, which is basically bandwidth. Bandwidth is how much information can be transferred from one end to the other. We also have customization, so how, let's say, personalized, and interactiveness. So interactiveness is how much we can interact with the system, how much input and output is the system going to give us. And then on the x-axis, we have reach, which is basically connectivity, which is getting to people, getting to different elements. Okay? So the question is, which one of the two curves do you think is right? Is it 1 or is it 2? It'd be nice to show a little show of hands. So who thinks 1 is the right curve? Who thinks 2 is the right curve? Okay. Well, that's correct. There is definitely a trade-off between the richness of information and the reach that we can actually acquire. There's definitely a trade-off between how much information and how rich that information is when we communicate and how many people we're able to reach. So, for example, when we're talking about a marketing mix, we're talking about the number of resources we have. Okay, we can decide to put a 30-second commercial on TV. We might want to send out a personalized, a targeted email, or we can have a salesperson speaking directly to the person. Obviously, as we move from that commercial towards the individual, the person, the salesperson, there's much more richness of information, but the reach goes down because obviously the commercial reaches a lot more people. So what does this have to do with AI? So let me give you an example of how this works, okay? So Dell was a huge disruptor in how computers were sold, okay? One of the biggest advances they were able to do was to customize those computers. And they were able to do it because predictively they were able to anticipate what people were going to order. Now, Dell had several ways of selling to people, okay? They had a direct sales force, which, like we spoke before, is very rich in information, is very interactive, it does not reach a lot of people. They had superstores, which again, you reach more people, but maybe the salespeople in the store aren't as prepared. And then you had telephone and fax, which was huge reach, but the amount of information you might transfer from one person to another through fax is not huge. Now, Dell did something that completely disrupted the industry, which was internet delivery. So all of a sudden, they could count with a little bit close to, or pretty much the same idea as they had with their direct sales force, but with huge reach that internet was able to give them. And so that was a very big shift in the paradigm. And so AI sort of does something very similar, where it allows us to interact with our customers in a way that is much more interactive, much more customizable. And it still allows us to do it with incredible reach. So if we look at the graph on the right, you can see that there's a total shift in that cost curve, where before it was extremely expensive to reach a lot of people with a huge richness of information, today is much cheaper. So basically, anybody that's able to leverage AI, anybody that's able to use it effectively, has a huge advantage in a very solid way, solid economic way. So, to my point is that transforming the digital customer journey is not a gimmick, it's not something cool to do for our customers. It's actually something that we have to do if we want to stay competitive. It's extremely important if you want to get ahead to do this and to understand how the customer journey is going to change because it's enabled by AI. Now, the problem with today's customer journey is that it's extremely rigid, it's extremely linear, okay, and we're just pushing people through a consecutive amount of steps that not a lot of people like to do. And so that's the old trade-off. We have huge reach, we're able to get to a lot of people, but it's not extremely rich in terms of interaction. So basically, if we are able to use AI effectively, we can disrupt the current cost curve and get ahead of our competition. And so, getting back to this, when we look at the customer journey today, it just looks like a funnel. It just looks like we're pushing people towards conversion. There's a number of reasons why that's the case. It's not always possible to give everybody with the previous technology what they wanted. But it's obvious that people see through these sort of ways of doing business. And people don't like being manipulated towards going to conversion. People like to have choice. So in the end, AI is a great thing because it gives people choice. It frees people to be able to ask and get what they want. Now, however dangerous that may be to give people what they want, it is a wonderful capability to have. So I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptive UIs because this is a great tool to transform that customer journey into something that is much more personalized and that is something that people might want to use a lot more. So what are adaptive interfaces? Adaptive interfaces are basically UIs that adapt to the layout and the content they're showing the user to that specific user. And so that changes the interaction completely. Now, building these type of interfaces is in a way complex. You need to use intelligent systems to help you bring about that richness of personalization. So you start with a first layer where you have content. And the content can be absolutely anything. It can be news, it can be products, it can be recipes, videos, whatever you want. And so the idea is that you want to serve that content in a way, and the right content, to the user. And so what you have in the middle is a bunch of information, a bunch of contextual information. And that contextual information might be about who the user is, about what the user is doing, about what the user has done in the past, and definitely about what's going on at the current moment with your business. And so when you feed those two things as an input into an intelligent system, that system is able to infer what is the best way to show the user that content and with what layout. Now, there are a lot of challenges in doing this because web developers really need to get over a lot of variables. So for example, component compatibility, device proliferation, which is basically a lot of different new devices, performance, this one's a biggie when you're talking about AI systems, consumer content trends, behavior and profiling, and finally the context. So there's a lot more that needs to be accounted by web developers when building these things. And that's, in a way, what makes it so complex. Now, AI-powered experiences go way beyond just the UI. They allow us to do much more different things and much more complex interactions with the user. And there are three things that really make AI-powered experiences stand out. The first one is there's a lot more ways in interacting with a digital system. When you look at traditional systems, all you have is the mouse and the keyboard, and it's all about pointing, clicking, and typing. When you're talking about interacting with digital systems in a more human way, there's everything from voice, image recognition, or even behavior. Because a lot of the interfaces and a lot of the systems, and I'll be giving some examples that we see today, use behavior as an input, even if we don't realize it. The second one is that AI, in a way, orchestrates all the modular services, all the APIs that we have in our backend. And that allows interactions to be much more dynamic. It's able to understand intent and context, and so it knows what it needs to call and when. So not all interactions are going to be the same. And thirdly, and this is probably the most important point of them all, is that machine learning systems help in simplifying the experience enormously. Now, one of the problems with traditional user journeys and traditional web frameworks or webs is that they show too much of the complexity that is in the backend, too much of the operational complexity, too much of the IT complexity. And we sort of oblige the user to deal with that complexity and to understand it and to know how to navigate it. And that's not very intuitive for a lot of people, and it's definitely not natural. It's not really something that we like doing. Now, artificial intelligence systems have a way of decomplexifying the experience in such a way that we hide all that ugliness that lives in the back. And so how does that happen? So the problem with today's user journeys is that they are actually a workaround of our current technical limitations. And so the two main technical limitations we have is, like I was saying, the first one is how you interact with the machine, the fact that you have to point and click. So you're in a way obliged to make websites where everything looks good, you're not going to get the user lost, they're going to know where to click and where to click next and where to click next, right? If you have something like voice, you might not need all these different steps or all these different interfaces. And the second reason why we have this sort of linear journey is because services need to recover information to give it on to the next service, right? Normally these services aren't really talking to each other or talking in a big database with a lot of data. They're sort of standalone. They're modular to the extreme. And so you need to build a UI on top of each of these interfaces for the interaction to work. So the actual user experience, the actual user journey, is not about giving people what they want. It's more about working around the limitations of our technology just to bring our businesses closer to people. Now, what if we didn't have these limitations? What if we could actually create experiences that are truly compelling and a user journey people actually want to interact with? And so there's a big change in the architecture and how these different systems are laid out when you're talking about adaptive interfaces, adaptive experiences. So the first idea, like I was saying, is that you have a user interface, whether it's voice, video, whatever, behavior, which is able to understand much more complex orders than just point and click. It allows people to interact naturally with it and to give it complex ideas, which is able to interpret and then feed to the more back-end services so they can manage it. Then you have a brain. And so the interesting part of this brain is that, in short, it acts as an orchestrator and as a rule manager. And so it knows what it needs, and it can go recover all of that automatically. So if it needs to ask something from the user, it will. If it doesn't, it won't. You're not constrained by a static UI where the user has to fill everything out, or you have to already fill it in for them. Okay? If they don't need to see it, they don't see it. And the brain is also in charge of calling the different services. So that means you can automate. That means you can call multiple services at the same time. You can accelerate that user journey as much or as little as the user wants. So there's no more reason to go step by step. Users can just go for as long or as short period as they like, as fast or as slow as possible. And so I want to talk a little bit about Leon, which is one of our assistants at Carrefour. And Leon uses adaptive user interfaces to create this sort of less linear user journey for users. Now, Leon is one of our first steps into this adaptive interface world. And the idea behind Leon is that buying online is all built around searching and browsing, which is extremely consuming in terms of mental load and in terms of time. So it's not for everybody all the time. The idea behind Leon is that it's able to simplify and accelerate the constitution of a basket, putting products into the basket. And so the way that Leon does that is with three elements specifically. So first, it uses user context and behavior, whether it's the present behavior or it's the past behavior of the user. It uses extended product information, so maybe things that we don't show users in terms of product, but an artificial intelligence might use, or an output of that artificial intelligence. And then the third one is we develop complementary features to the website. We understand that there is a lack on the website of certain elements, but as in itself, the website is already standalone. So it doesn't make sense to just go ahead and replicate the whole thing. And so this is an example of how Leon works. Leon is an assistant that stands on the side while you're navigating the website. And so one of the first examples is when a user arrives to the landing page. When a user arrives to the landing page, what they'll usually do is they'll go to a list, they'll browse a little bit, but in the end what they want to do is they want to add products to their basket. Now, if you're a user on which I already have information, and you're a user who I already know what you've bought in the past, why don't I help you do this faster? So Leon, right off the bat, shows the user products that they've previously bought, but in such a way that we know which one's the most probable you're going to buy. Because if you've been buying hundreds of products, you don't want to browse through all of them. So this is one of the first examples. And when the user clicks to add the product, Leon displays all the other products that have been bought together, because it infers that you're trying to put together a basket that you did in the past. And so that all goes into the idea of accelerating that user journey and that basket. Now, what if you're looking at a product? We could say there are two main reasons why people look at products. Because they want to buy a product, or maybe because they want to discover a product. And so those are two very different contexts, two different intents. And so because we know what users have bought in the past, we can sort of infer whether the person is just browsing a product that they already bought because they want to know a little bit more about it, maybe alternatives, or if they want to know what this product is in comparison to another. So in this case, the Coca-Cola is a product that is usually being bought. And this specific user usually buys tuna with that. And so we show tuna because that is the most probable next search that the user is going to do. What about products that a user doesn't usually buy? Because if you're browsing a product, you want to discover it, you want to know more about it. What's a better way of knowing a product than knowing what other products are similar to it? What other products you could find as an alternative? And now, the complexity here is that not everybody compares products on the same lines. Some people are more sensitive to price. Some people are more sensitive to promotion, which is a sort of derivative price. Some people are more interested in the nutritional value of the food you're eating. So in all those cases, you can reorder the way that Leon is showing you those products. And the idea is that users just navigate the website and Leon understands what sort of context is going on and shows relevant information and the relevant UI to that user. Now another interesting case is once you've already put together your basket, there's always a little bit of tuning users want to do. Is this my perfect basket? Right? And one of the first features we thought about including with Leon is the idea of analyzing nutritionally your basket. And so if you have a certain product that, for example, in this case, the peanuts, they're an E, and you want to eat a little bit healthier, Leon allows you to do so by finding alternatives that are higher in terms of nutritional score. Now, like I was saying before, adapting to technology is not enough. It's not only a question of how do we adapt our architecture and our processes to work with technology. It's all about people. True transformation is all about people. So that means both users and the people that work professionally with those products or behind this, all right? So we need to put people front and center, absolutely. And so that means talking about user expectations and user behavior, essentially, okay? So, like I said, AI will decentralize this capacity to make decisions. And so, although that is a huge advantage, it also brings problems, right? It brings things that we need to think a little bit more about in terms of how are users going to react to that. So, normally when a user is in front of an automatic system, what is that user expecting to see? What is too much? What is not enough in terms of engagement? So it's very important that the experience is tuned from front to back. It's very important that both the part that is aimed at the UI, the UI or the user experience is aligned with the model built in the back. So in this section, I'm going to start talking about some of the negative expectations or sort of the bad image that AI has, because this is definitely something you're going to have to contend with when you get into building artificial intelligence systems, especially in a business to consumer sort of setting. Okay, we're then going to look at how you work around this. So that implies that we're going to be talking about how we're going to explain what the system does and how do we gain the user's trust, how do we get feedback from the user and give them some of the control back. And then, of course, AI systems are not perfect, so they've got limitations. How do we work around these limitations? How do we make it work in a fluid way, in any case? So, what's very interesting is that we're not in a completely new context. So, after Freud's theories became popular, there's been a lot of people that have tried to hack behavior and that have tried to hack people's minds. Okay, and one of the first of these people was Edward Bernays. He was related to Freud. And so he went to the United States, and he was one of the first person to apply Freud's theories to commercial applications, sort of like marketing. And his theories were used to see how they managed to get people to consume a lot more. There's sort of a manipulation of the behavior. And a few years back, everybody heard, the world was totally scandalized by what Cambridge Analytica did with data and how they were able to make a link between data and changing customer behavior and the sort of power that gave you on a large scale. So it's only normal that people feel insecure because their data has been misused for their disadvantage several times. And so we're also hearing a lot of stories about how big tech is doing this. Big tech employs people that are called attention engineers, and they put a lot of work into seeing how they can garner more engagement from users, how they can keep them addicted to using their experiences. And I'll talk about why that is. And so they use mechanics sort of like, as an example, autoplay. So Netflix will autoplay the shows one after the other to keep you watching. You have infinite scroll on Instagram, so you'll always have content or constant notifications, which will just keep drawing you back into that app that you have on your phone. What is very interesting, actually, is that two of the greatest thinkers around the apocalyptic possibilities of technology and artificial intelligence were so long ago, but they're starting to be so right, depending on the context and the place. So you guys probably know George Orwell, 1984, and Aldous Huxley for Brave World. And so these are comics that place both their ideas one on top of the other. So where Orwell was scared that the world would ban books, Huxley was scared that nobody would read books because there was plenty of other stuff to do. It kind of rings a bell, right? Where Orwell was scared of a world where we were misinformed and there were lies, Huxley was scared that there would be so much information that the truth would be hidden. Whereas Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed. Sorry, this is the one I just mentioned. Orwell also feared that we would be captive, that we would be slaves to our society. Whereas Huxley was scared that we would become menial, unimportant. And I love the sort of examples he gives. A guy playing video games, a guy completely addicted to Twitter and tweeting all night, people watching TV, a guy looking at himself on the mirror and flexing. These sort of menial things instead of worrying about the big questions. And so basically, and this is a great phrase from Huxley, is that we were unable to realize that the human mind just has an infinite appetite for distractions. Okay? And so people are conscious of all of this. This is not something that everybody's unaware of. And people are extremely vigilant of falling into these traps. And more, there's a lot of conversation on this. Okay? So one of the biggest challenges when designing AI or systems oriented towards people is trust. How do you get people to trust your system? How do you get people to trust that the output of your system is actually something that has their best interests in mind? And you will be surprised because people mistrust these systems a lot. I'll give you some examples, okay? But first, let's talk about how to help people calibrate their trust. How much can they trust the system or not? So when you're in AI, you know that models generally are probabilistic. They don't always give you the same answer. So in a way, you have to build that experience in such a way that you tell users how much they can trust your system. How does that probabilistic aspect work? There's also the problem where algorithms are not always explainable. Sometimes they're black boxes. So you have to make a very big effort to think about how you're going to explain to the user how your algorithm reached a specific conclusion. And then finally, you have to be careful about how users are going to use the information that comes out of your model. Again, it relates a little bit to how they can calibrate their trust. A way of doing this is by showing them confidence in their models. So how confident is your model about what you're showing? Now there's another problem, and it's not only about trust in technology, it's also a problem of choice. There are so many options today, we're drowned in them. Okay? And I'm going to give you an example of how choice can be managed by artificial intelligence and how that clashes with user trust. So this is another one of our assistants. This one specifically is a voice assistant developed in Spain. And the idea of this assistant is that you can make a list of products that is added to your basket using your voice. So you can just say oranges, bananas, etc., and the assistant will turn that into a product and add it to your basket. Now, if I tell you that I want banana, what are you going to respond to me? What banana? Which banana do I choose? What do I have available, right? And so that's one of the big issues with these sort of systems, is that the system is going to automatically choose for the user. If the choice that the system does is right, well, there's no problem. But that's not always the case. And so you're going to find a lot of users asking, why did it recommend this product? What is the intent behind it? Is it commercial? What do you get out of it? Or is it actually something that is in my interest? And that's a very hard question to respond when you have a very small UI. Where do you explain that? How do you do that, right? So this is one of the big challenges today in using artificial intelligence, that part of trust and that part where if the system is wrong, how do you tell the user, well, you know, I wasn't so sure about it, but I had to give you something. So another very important aspect of building AI systems is how do you balance control and automation? Okay, so how much information do you actually need as an autonomous system to work? All right, and you don't want to be asking the user all the time for information. All the information you can infer, you want to do that, but there are times where you want to ask. So for example, if the user tells you, I want bananas, one of the design decisions that you can make is ask him which banana and give him 3 to choose from. Or you're just going to show him a button, choose your bananas, or here's the automatic choice, right? So there's a lot of considerations in how you balance the part of automation and the control with the user, okay? Another very important point is how the system communicates the value, okay? So if you're interacting with an automatic system, what am I getting out of it, and when am I actually going to get that value delivered to me? Very important point, okay? And then finally, users need to understand how they can influence the model. So if a user is using an artificial intelligence system, they definitely want to help improve it. So the idea is, how are users able to tell the model where it has to go in the future? How does it improve? A really good example of this is how Uber does it. I'm sure all of you know this. This is a surge pricing. And so the way that Uber's models calculate this pricing mechanic is by the number of people that open the Uber app on their phone, which is an interesting input for the model because it's based on behavior. It's something rather passive. Now, it's not something that works in the benefit probably of users, but it's definitely something very interesting how you use it, right? And so one of the first things they do is, hey, my artificial intelligence pricing system is telling me I gotta price this higher. It's gonna be 2.6 higher, okay? And then on the bottom they tell you, but it's only gonna be for 2 minutes. So right there, they're giving you a lot of information of how that artificial intelligence system is functioning. And then they give you 2 options. I either want to accept the rate, or just tell me in a little while and maybe I'll come back. This is another example of something that we do at Carrefour, which is basically product similarity, okay? And this is a trade-off that we did in terms of automation and control. The idea is that people might not always want to substitute a product, so we allow them to choose when they want to substitute it or not, and then can actually use this for navigation, okay? So the idea here is not, how do I manipulate my user to buy more products, to upsell? It's got nothing to do with that. It's about, how do I give my user more information about that product? How do I do in such a way that if he sees a product that is interesting to him but is not quite right, how do I give him more similar options without having made him spend an hour searching and just looking through all the different products? Well, this is a way AI can actually make that part of the experience much better, much more fluid. Another example I love is how Spotify makes their weekly playlist. So this tool is a tool that's called Nelson. It's freely available online if you Google it. And this is a tool that Spotify uses to sort of explain how their recommendation algorithm puts together those lists. And if you guys use Spotify, you know that the way that Spotify puts together the weekly playlist is through behavior. Whatever you're listening to a specific week, it's going to take that and it's going to find recommendations based on that. So your actual input, the actual way you're giving Spotify feedback is by listening to music. And if you don't use the weekly playlist, they also know. So that's also a sort of passive feedback where they know they have to improve the algorithm or the way it works. Okay, so final point, very important, extremely complicated, is how you get around the limitations of your artificial intelligence system. And trust me, there will be, and there will be a lot. And the problem with artificial intelligence systems, like I was saying, is that they are probabilistic. So they're not always going to give you that same result. They're not always going to give you what you're expecting. So defining what an error is not always that simple. It's not just a red box on your screen that says error. It might be working perfectly well. Nobody realizes it's not performing how it should, but the user is like, what is this? And that is an error. And this is a failure. These are the kind of things that you really need to establish from the beginning in order to have a really good experience. And so one great way to get around that is to identify what those error sources are. What kind of things make the model fail more? Or what kind of things is the model doing that people have a harder time understanding? And so the best way to get about that is not to try and solve that error constantly, because if it's a limitation, sometimes it's just better to accept it and to give the user a way to get around that problem. And many times that's a fail-safe. Many times that's just simply taking away control from the automatic system and giving it back to the user. So once you've adapted to technology and the user behavior aligns with our expectations, what is it that comes next? Well, definitely organizations are going to have to evolve. They're going to have to change. There's a bunch of considerations that the moment users' behavior and expectations change, society has to change as a whole. So first I'm going to talk about the issue of logging users out because they don't give you the data, of developing systems that don't work as well because you don't have user data. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why loyalty and habit are becoming very important assets. And this goes back to what we were discussing before about attention engineers. Habit is very important today, not only for the tech industry, for every industry, and it's becoming more so. I'm also going to talk a lot about the proliferation of assistants. Why is this happening, right? Why are so many assistants becoming popular? Why is this becoming such a big word? And lastly, I'm going to talk about freemium subscriptions and partnerships because they're also becoming extremely popular. Okay? So there is a very big issue with systems that are too dependent on user data. It poses important risks, right? But the problem today is that people expect systems, they expect experiences to remember them. They expect to be understood, and they expect for you to know what they already want. And if they don't have that sort of experience, they churn. They go to the competitor. And so the thing is that as automation becomes more critical, as artificial intelligence systems become more critical, having data on users is more and more important. So what are you going to do with the users whom you don't have data? What are you going to do with those new users? And this is, for example, an issue that we're tackling with Leon, because Leon is mainly focused towards people who we have data about, who we have their product history about. Another issue is loyalty and habit. So, as you all probably already know, artificial intelligence systems, machine learning, usually performs well when it's sort of continuous, when there's nothing erratic in the data. It's easily recurrent, there's nothing new, right? The problem is that they underperform when there's a lot of change, when there's a lot of unexpected things, right? If you're an organization and you're fully based, your systems are AI driven, and you want to optimize those costs, risk is equal to cost. So the more predictable you are, the cheaper you're going to be for the company to maintain. So loyalty and habit is not only about you coming back to the company more often, it's also going to become something that is very important to a company's costs. And so that's going to grow in terms of importance. And of course, for companies like Spotify or Netflix, which are based on subscription, the fact that you're loyal and have a habit of using them means you're going to keep coming back. Another really interesting trend that we're seeing,
But when does loyalty and habit become a problem? Because, for example, my experience with Spotify, especially recently, has been pretty poor in the sense that I have probably 1,500 liked songs in my liked songs playlist, which is automatically generated by them. And every time I press shuffle play, I get probably a sample from the same 200 songs.
Okay.
And the thing is, sort of create, which I don't really like because it's in my liked songs. In my liked songs, I like everything I have. So it's sort of like giving me a slice of what I like, but that is growing on me in a bad way, because every time it's like the same songs. I'm like, okay, just skip it. I press like half of my time skipping songs that I've been listening for the past week.
Yeah.
And so when does that become a problem? I would rather have Spotify try to propose me something else, see how it reacts, and then on that either like stay loyal or keep exploring.
Right. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, but I think that there's also a question of how you use a system. So like I was saying before, and this is a very important issue with how Spotify talks to people and tells them, how am I proposing new things, right? So they're not doing a great job in explaining how their algorithms are proposing new things. But what's clear is that Spotify uses your behavior to give you the following recommendation or to continue serving you content. And so if you yourself don't force yourself to change your behavior on the platform is just going to continue doing the same thing. So what you probably need to do is change your behavior. Try listening to other playlists, try using search, etc. I agree that it's not optimal, and they'll have to work on that, but that is the way it is built today. And I'll talk about locking in users in that sense later, because it definitely is a problem. So proliferation of augmented assistants, okay? This is an interesting one. So why are assistants becoming so interesting? So what is clear is that the fact that there's new interfaces with which users can interact is very interesting for companies, especially voice. Because if you think about it, voice allows a user to interact with a lot of services from one same interface. You can ask it whatever you want, and it'll do it, right? And so the problem is that in order to use voice and in order to use different new types of interfaces, you need artificial intelligence. And that means having assistants, okay? So this is a new trend, and for example, we can see with the new Surface from Google, Stadia, where they're putting their assistant so you can actually also use YouTube or whatever while you're playing. And then freemium subscription and partnerships. This is an important one, and I think that it also pertains to your question. So in machine learning, there's this problem that is very similar to not having data from a user, which is a cold start, where a system is not able to infer or to predict something because it doesn't have enough information. And so the thing is that organizations are starting to use your data in a competitive manner, because if they know something about you, they're able to reduce entry barriers. It makes it easier for you to adopt your service. And they also raise exit barriers. It makes it harder for you to leave their service. So for example, if you have all your music on Spotify, it's complicated you're going to go to Deezer because you've already got your great recommendations on Spotify, right? And the thing is that there's a bunch of organizations that aren't as digital and can't do that, and the way they get around that is through a partnership. Because if you share your data, you level the competitive ground, you level it out. And so nobody has a huge advantage, and you can go back to the way things were played before, okay? Very quickly, I'm going to conclude. So 3 points for the conclusion. The AI transformation requires a different mindset. It's not only about how you use AI, okay? When you use AI and when you transform that customer journey, you have to think about customer behavior and customer expectations, okay? And so once those two things happen, organizations are going to evolve. And these trends are going to start appearing and they're going to start accelerating. And to end very quickly, this is to the question you were asking. The big problem we have today is that AI perpetuates behavior. And the problem is that you get into a loop. If I propose to you to eat the same thing all the time, you're never going to improve. Never. You're going to always eat well if you eat well, or badly if you eat badly. So for example, one of the things we do with Leon is that feature I was talking about of how do you eat healthier, how do you improve that basket in such a way that it's done so the user can do it within the system, and the system doesn't break or it doesn't ask itself what's going on. And so that's all. Any questions?
Yes, for the healthier alternatives, are you using the scoring index given by, for instance, the French government or the...
Yeah.
Is that what you use?
So we're using, so it's Nutri-Score calculation. And the source of the data is, we have different partners, but in this case it's food facts.
So it's open access?
Yeah, it's open access. Yeah.
How do you handle all the data you have? Because with that data you can basically make a profile for every customer of what they eat. Like, do you share the data with companies?
Normally, at the moment, no. At the moment, the data is something that is kept very closely inside Carrefour. In certain cases, we might share data with a partner in terms of to develop an algorithm or something, something that is going to go for internal use. But in terms of partnerships and sharing data, it's something that still needs to be built. It's ongoing. It's important, but for now it's very close.
So the goal is to give the data to other companies?
So no. The data is never to give away the data, to give away your data. Okay. That's it's very much protected by the GDPR.
So specific to the Spotify case, for their song recommendation algorithm, they said they'd actually be able to scale and actually have like real-time song recommendation for like millions of people.
Yeah.
They use like they just use like k-means clustering, which is pretty simple,
Yeah.
but it's easy to scale. So I think that's kind of like a conscious choice that they made. To
The
be able
Spotify
to be
recommendation
performant
algorithm.
Pardon?
The recommendation algorithm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the recommendation algorithm actually is much more complex than just the k-means. If you look at this example, if you look at the bars, they have a number of variables, right? So they have musicality, popularity, energy, acousticness, sensibility. And so the way the model is built is actually on several layers. Okay, the first layer is a deep learning algorithm that analyzes the song and it extracts features from that song. So basically, it will tell you what the rhythm of a specific song, and it will transfer that into data for you to input into a second model. They have another model for which is a word to vec. So they vectorize the names and the content, the words in the song, and they make a model of that, and then they do the k-means. But I think the k-means is actually more in terms of reducing dimensionality than as a classifier. It's used more to reduce the amount of data. They just put it on a plane, you know, and then they feed it into the algorithm because otherwise it's a crazy amount.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, just have a quick question. So, if we go back to more classic retail, where suppliers are really competing for shelf space, now when we have something like Neon that tries to give the best possible product needs to a user,
Yeah.
how much leverage does say Kraft have in trying to influence that suggestion?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I think that the idea behind what I'm saying is that users need transparency. It's not so much a question of disrupting how business as usual is made. It's just a question of if you're pushing an item and promoting it, just let the user know. So they can actually decide if that is something they want or not. Any more questions? Thank you.
Yeah. I do like one chat.
All right, thanks a lot, guys.
It's like secret levers that always